This is the Limitless Leadership Lounge, where Coach and Jon learn along with you from some of the world's most decorated leaders. Recently promoted, let's sharpen the saw together.
So you were just promoted, and you have a great position as a young leader. But one of the most difficult challenges that comes up right away, the fact that you're still one of the youngest members of the team. This can get really awkward in leadership because you're actually leading people who are older than you, who likely feel like, since they have more experience than you, maybe they've been around in the organization for longer, they feel like they should be the leaders. Yet you're the one holding the leadership position, which is great for you, but also might create some relational tension. How do we approach this? That's what we're going to talk about today on the Limitless Leadership Lounge. I'm Jon Goehring, and Coach Jim Johnson, and I have 4 pieces of advice for you if you are in this exact situation, because we've both been there. Coach was a head coach at 25 years old in high school, and then he held multiple positions as a young coach. So, Coach, let's start with our first tip on how to navigate this exact situation.
To me, it starts with, is one of the keys I talk about in leadership, and that's lead by example. It doesn't matter what age you are, still the person that's always on stage, and people are looking, whether they're older or younger than you, they're going to follow your example. If you're consistent with your example and that you're leading, being cognizant that I have to lead by my words and actions consistently, which means on a daily basis. And let me build you a story. Jon mentioned I was a head coach at 25, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit. When I was 36, I took over the Greece Athena basketball program. And ironically, my 2 middle school coaches, both had been head coaches, and both had applied for that job. And I beat them out for that. And one was approximately 12 years older than me. Another one was 19 years older than me. And so the one thing that I wanted to start right away is that I acknowledged that, I appreciated their experience, and we'll delve into that. But the first thing I did was that I was going to model the behavior I expected on and off the court. And I really became cognizant as a leader of how important it is every single day, because we hear it all the time. You must lead by example. But how many times do people fail because they say one thing and they do another, which crushes trust? And we want to build trust with our entire team, whether they're younger than us, the same age as us, or much older. In my case, I had 2 assistant coaches that had a lot of experience, wanted the job, and yet I knew that I had to be the model for them day in and day out. And because of that, it wasn't perfect going. I'm not going to say that, but it definitely helped because they could see that I was willing to put the work in. I was going to lead by example, and I had a real vision of where we wanted to take the program. Jon, how about you?
Well, I think as a young leader myself, I was able to be in a position of authority over a couple of different people as a young early 20s man at the radio stations. And that was a very challenging scenario because at first leadership kind of got to my head. And I don't want to say that I was disrespectful in any way, but I did lack respect of the experience of these older individuals. And it's so important when you're leading somebody who is older than you age-wise that you still respect the experience that they have more than you. And now this might be experience in the workplace, this might be experience at a particular company, or it could simply just be life experience. And what happens when you respect their experience and you don't think that you're the know-it-all leader is they start to respect you back, because there's nothing worse than having a cocky leader who's younger than you and you're thinking, that kid thinks he knows it all or thinks she knows it all, and then you start to grow this distaste for them because of that. But when you respect your elders, even if they technically are in a position lower than you on the totem pole, remember, leadership is not always about position, and it's not just authority. So keeping that in perspective and keeping what being a leader means in perspective to you is so important, especially as a young leader, because it's so easy for us to let that get to our heads. And remember, as a leader, you're there to serve. You're not there to exert your authority or be the one with all the answers. In fact, you don't have all the answers. And as a leader, respecting their experience, if they're older than you, is a great way to help them help you find all the answers as the leader. So it's so important to respect somebody's experience if they're older than you. That will hopefully diffuse some of the tension between you and the person who might think that they should be the leader. And it's the beginning of a great relationship between the two of you.
Great point, John. And my third key is something that's, again, fairly obvious, but again, often leaders don't think about doing that. And is how do you build relationships? I talk a lot building relationships with my team members, and I was a high school basketball coach. They were all younger, but building relationships and going back to my story at Greece Athena, where I had two middle school coaches that had a lot of experience and they were both quite a bit older than me. So the first thing I did is I knew them, but didn't know them well. So I sat down with them one on one, and that's one of the things I really encourage leaders that you got to meet with your team members, your staff one on one, and get to know them and ask them questions about their life and getting to know about their families and what's most important to them, and really also share the appreciation. Like I would often go to my two middle school coaches because they had a lot of success down there, and it's like, wow, you guys are doing a terrific job on how you're teaching the fundamentals and getting our kids off to a great start and building that championship mindset that we're trying to build each day at Greece Athena. So I think it's really important, and I've used this before, but you got to have that curiosity to be willing to ask questions and get to know people. And then the last thing is, I often say this, but it took me quite a while. It was really after a few years at Athena, it really hit me, is that, you know what, as a leader, you're looking for the best answers to help your team move forward. But this is the big challenge. It doesn't have to be. And often it was not my answer. I had some ideas, but by asking my experienced coaches, hey, what would you do in this situation? And not to say that I use their advice every single time, because that's not the point. But the one thing that when you ask questions and then you share, wow, I really like that concept. And this is the thing I used to answer both my players and my assistant coaches when they would give me a suggestion. One of two ways. I would say, wow, that's really a good suggestion. And I'm going to implement that starting tomorrow. All right. And they show that I really took action on their idea. Or vice versa, I say, I really appreciate the idea. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work because of this. And then I'll share why. Now, they may not totally agree because it's their idea. But when you show the respect, which is something you mentioned, John, for them, and the fact that they do have really good ideas and share that you're going to use the idea, show them. And if you're not going to use that idea, share with them why you're not. But building those relationships day in and day out is so significant because you use this in another one, John, and I know I'm being redundant, but it's so important, is that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care about them. And that's something that I believe my two older assistants felt that I really cared about them.
That's well said, Coach. And I'm going to be redundant right back at you because a lot of my last point actually touches on one thing that you just said. And my last point is talking about diffusing tension by involving that older teammate in the decision-making process and explaining the reasoning for your decisions. There's nothing worse than a leader who just, and how many of you have had this type of leader who just sends out a blanket email that says, this is the way we're doing this moving forward. No explanation. And maybe technically they don't owe you an explanation. And maybe that's okay in some scenarios. But if that becomes a habit as a leader, you're really starting to extend that bridge between you and your teammates a little bit. And all of a sudden, you're not really on a level playing field. You're just the authority, that high up authority that sends out messages, blanket messages once in a while that exercises that authority. So involving your teammates in the decision-making process is important as any leader. But I think it amplifies the importance of it when that teammate is older than you as the leader. So involve them in the decision-making process. And then, but you said something important, Coach. Sometimes you can't always make the decision that they would prefer. And I think about this even outside, because leadership, remember, is not just in the boardroom, right? Leadership is at home too. It's in your personal life. And one example that I think when I think about this is when your parents are getting older and you, for example, realize that it may not be safe for them to be out on the road anymore. And that's one example where you, as the younger person, turns into the leader in that scenario, and they may not like the decision that you make to take the keys away, for example, or to encourage them to go get checked at the doctor for something if they're stubborn about it, but you have to do it as the leader. When you do it, though, to diffuse tension as much as possible, and you explain the reasoning behind it, like you mentioned, Coach, that's the best possible thing you can do to diffuse tension in your personal life and in your professional leadership. So those are four really important points, Coach. I'm glad. I know there was some overlap with those, but I think that's so important to talk about when we're talking about people who are older than us who we're leading. We may have the title over them, but it's important to remember and respect that they do have age and life experience that we don't. And that can actually, when used right, can help us become an even better leader.
It's a great point, John. And my final thought would be this is you understand, and I'll give you an example in basketball. During a game, I had to make a lot of decisions quickly. So I did want input from my assistants on that, but sometimes I didn't have time to explain to them. Now, that was why at the post game, I would meet with my staff and we would talk about some of that. But when you're making quick, instantaneous decisions, you start to build a relationship with the idea that I want your suggestions, but I'm not going to use them all, or in some cases, not use a lot of them. But you do owe them at some time, because if it's a quick decision, then afterwards doing a little postmortem about what you decided and sharing your thoughts on that. But I loved your thought of the fact that you got to involve your people, especially your older people, so they feel like they're a part of the process to help move this team forward in a great direction.
And I do want to make one more point too, Coach, because I think you and I are a good example of this. So here's where you have to check your ego at the door. You think you're a leader. You have that title over somebody. Now your perceived value is higher, but we have to remember that we are all leaders. All right. So, Coach, you are a leader of me in many cases. But also remember, last week I had to go to your house and help you with some technology stuff too, right? So in that scenario, I was a leader in that scenario. So our relationship is a perfect example of we both lead each other in some ways. And isn't that life in general, right? Isn't that life in all the relationships you have? As a husband and wife, as a boyfriend and girlfriend, you're a leader. Maybe even as a parent and a child. A child is a leader of a parent in some ways, even as much as the parent is in the leadership position over the child. So just remember that every position you have in life can be a leadership position. And if you think you start to let that get to your head and think that you now have more worth because you're in a leadership position than someone, no matter what their age is, then you start to put yourself in a really bad position.
Well said, John. And some we call that reverse mentoring, because you've certainly have
Mm-hmm.
mentored me in a lot of phases of my life, and I believe I've mentored you in some other phases of life. So using that wisdom of being older, but also as an older person, realizing I got a lot to learn from these younger people as well.
That's a good point. One of those classic situations, if you're an older person listening to this, is how well do you do social media? Think about that, right? If you want to improve your social media. Now, I know there's some older folks out there who are great at it, but for the majority of people, I think of people who want to hire young people for that. So we're all leaders in different areas in our lives, and that's important. And when we take on that mindset as a leader, and we also take on the servant leadership mindset of when I'm a leader, it's not here to exert my authority. I'm actually here to serve. Then that fundamentally transforms how we see ourselves as leaders and how we see our teams. So I really hope that helped you today talking about leadership. If you're in that scenario where one of your team members is older than you and it feels awkward and uncomfortable, put those advice and tips that we have for you into practice, and then add your own. Feel free to contact us, Coach Jim Johnson on LinkedIn or Jon Goehring on LinkedIn, or of course you can send us an email, limitlessleadershippodcast@gmail.com. If you're up on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, so that you can always get notified about the new videos and coming out for you. And if you're listening on the podcast platforms, we thank you for checking us out on Apple or Spotify or whatever other platform you're listening on. We'll be back next week for another conversation on leadership. We'll actually have a guest on next week, which I'm really excited about. And we'll catch you next time on the Limitless Leadership Lounge.